as I've been saying, is all about this chap here. It's all about George Gershwin. And I've entitled this lecture today, Blue Lullaby. And there's a very, very good reason. Before we meet the composer of the day, and it turns out actually quite coincidentally that Gershwin is this week's Composer of the Week on BBC Radio 3, so plenty of listening for you to enjoy. We're actually going to start with a performance of a piece, and this is the second of his 3 preludes which Gershwin composed in 1927. And the reason we're starting here is this piece is one of the best ways to kind of sum up, to encapsulate Gershwin's style. It is achingly beautiful. It has a line that is yearning and soothing at the same time. It could have been written by one of the great French masters, Debussy or Ravel. It could even have been written by Chopin, except for the fact that there are underlying jazz and ragtime influences throughout. And Gershwin composed this piece just as he was on the cusp of making it big. He was about to enter the most productive and successful period of his career. And he called this piece a kind of blue lullaby. So to launch our lecture today, here is Anna to play you this lovely piece to get you kind of in the mood, as they say. So here is Anna playing Gershwin's Blue Lullaby. A superb performance of Gershwin's second prelude, known as the Blue Lullaby, composed in 1927. And one of the comments from the people here live today, which is echoed by several, is, I love it, it sounds so Gershwin-y. Well, it does, because obviously it's by Gershwin, but what does it mean to be Gershwin? How did he end up sounding like Gershwin? Well, this is the man himself, George Gershwin, born in Brooklyn in New York on September the 26th, 1898, just on the cusp of the 20th century. And he composed both for Broadway and the Classical Concert Hall, and he created a bridge between not just these two styles, but so many other styles that was uniquely his own. I think of him as one of the ultimate melting pot composers. Growing up as he did in the vast melting pot that was New York, he took upon himself, brought together so many different styles, was always looking for ways to develop and to be unique. And despite his untimely death at the age of only 38, he left behind a substantial body of work which remains hugely popular to this day. Gershwin's music is ultimately a testament to his creativity, his understanding of popular tastes, and this ability to blend different musical styles together into a distinctive voice. So let's talk about his early days. Here is a photograph taken of Brooklyn in 1898. And George Gershwin was born as Jakob Gershwin to Russian Jewish immigrant parents Moish Gershowitz and Rosa Bruskin. The surname was, although written Gershwin, think Gershwin with an E on the end, it was pronounced Gershwin after the Russian Yiddish tradition. And he was the second of 4 children. You'll all, I'm sure, be aware of his older brother, Ira, with whom he collaborated an awful lot in his later life. But he also had a younger brother and a younger sister, both of whom are very musical. In fact, his sister, Frances, was the first member of the family to actually become a musician. Now, the family were very poor. Being Russian Jewish immigrants. They lived in a cold water flat in Brooklyn, which is exactly what you think it is. And the hustle and bustle of the city undoubtedly influenced the young Gershwin. Now, his parents were not particularly musical, but they did buy a piano. It's one of the things that most people had in those days. But they bought it not for George, but for Ira to play. Much to Ira's relief, however, George was the person who took to the instrument and spent countless hours playing it as a child, setting the stage for his future career. Now, at the age of 10, the young George began studying piano under Charles Hambowitz. Now, he was the principal pianist in the Beethoven Symphony Orchestra in New York. And until Hambowitz died in 1918, he remained Gershwin's musical mentor. He taught him his exceptional piano technique and introduced him to the music of the European classical tradition, encouraging him to attend orchestral concerts, even though, of course, he was as poor as a church mouse. And Hambowitz noted the young George's enthusiasm and potential and was crucial in developing Gershwin's innate musical talent. However, Gershwin's early influences were not just confined to the classical music he learned from Hambowitz, otherwise he would have been more of a classical composer. Growing up as he did in the heart of New York's Yiddish theatre districts, and you can see here the Jacob P. Adler Grand Theatre in Brooklyn, which no longer exists, but this was one of many prominent theatres in the district. And this is one of the places where Gershwin would have visited regularly to hear the rhythms and sounds of the city's streets. Indeed, he would later describe his music several times as a musical kaleidoscope of America. Now, as a young man, bear with me a moment, in his teens, Gershwin was introduced to the vibrant world of jazz, and this too would come to have a profound impact on his work. He was drawn, in this case, to the innovative rhythms, the fresh harmonies, and the distinctly American style of the music, bearing in mind that both the classical influence and the Yiddish theatre music was all imported, but jazz was a uniquely American voice, and he would later incorporate jazz elements into his compositions in pioneering ways. In fact, the great Quincy Jones is on record as saying that Gershwin took jazz from the streets, dressed her up, and took her into the concert hall. Now, at this point, we need to talk about a particular place that was hugely influential on Gershwin, and it's this place here. This is known as Tin Pan Alley, and some of you might have heard of Tin Pan Alley, and you might think it refers to a style, because many people think it does, but actually it refers to a specific place, and it's West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in the Flower District of Manhattan. Now, these buildings still exist, though of course they are no longer strings of music publishers. They're all now trendy coffee shops. But back then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Tin Pan Alley was a collection of music publishers and songwriters that dominated the public music and popular music of the USA. Now, the name was given to this, we believe, this is as far as we can work out, because of the collective sound made by so many cheap and out of tune upright pianos, all thumping away, playing different tunes, being reminiscent of the banging of tin pans in an alleyway. Now, Gershwin ended up working on Tin Pan Alley as a young man, and he would take the jazz he discovered there into the mainstream by splicing its rhythms and tonalities into the popular songs of the era. Now, in 1913, Gershwin was only 15. He left school to become what was known as a song plugger on Tin Pan Alley, and this was partly as an arranger. This was partly about arranging existing songs and playing them into a pianola so as to produce the piano rolls, which were so popular in those days, bearing in mind that recorded sound and cylinders and discs and so on was still quite rare and quite expensive. But a lot of places had pianolas, so you would buy a piano roll so the piano would play itself in the corner. Gershwin made a decent living playing in and recording these piano rolls. But he also composed, and over the course of this early period of his life, he actually earned as much as $15 a week working for Jerome H. Remick and Company, which had an office on Tin Pan Alley. That's actually quite a substantial sum for such a young man. His first published song, as you can see here, was published when he was 17, and it's called, it's a great title, When You Want 'Em, You Can't Get 'Em, and When You've Got 'Em, You Don't Want 'Em. So this was published in 1916, and it earns the 17-year-old Gershwin the grand sum of 50 cents. But it wasn't until 1919 that the young Gershwin scored his first big national hit with his song Swanee, with words by Irving Caesar. Now, of course, many of you will know Swanee as having been sung by Al Jolson, who was a Broadway star and former minstrel singer. And he heard Gershwin perform Swanee at a party and decided to sing it in one of his shows. And, of course, Al Jolson is a really important figure in the development of film music. Now, although the practice of the black and white minstrel shows are long since past, and quite right too, we can't get away from the fact that The Jazz Singer, which starred Al Jolson, was actually the first ever film to have a recorded soundtrack. More on that next week. But it wasn't until 1924 that Gershwin started to really break through as a serious composer, when he composed his first major work, Rhapsody in Blue. Now, this was originally written for a small band and piano, but was orchestrated to different sizes, from a chamber orchestra, a theatre orchestra, up to a full symphony orchestra by his friend Ferdi Gruffi. And it was first premiered by Paul Whiteman's concert band in New York, and you can actually listen to a very early recording of this first version. Interestingly, this piece almost didn't exist. It was a commission for a festival, and Gershwin originally turned the commission down, and it wasn't until the man who'd tried to get him to write a piece for this festival goaded him by saying that one of his competitors was going to get this plum job instead, that Gershwin decided to actually roll up his sleeves and get writing. And we're so glad he did, because it subsequently went on to be one of his most popular works and really established Gershwin's signature style and his genius in blending, as we've said already, these vastly different musical styles, including jazz and classical, into this revolutionary new sound. And in terms of creating this sound, well, Gershwin looks no further than the sounds of America. In fact, he was on the train when he came up with much of what became Rhapsody in Blue. This is a quote from the man himself. It said, "It was on the train with its steely rhythms, its rattlety-bang, that is so often so stimulating to a composer. I frequently hear music in the very heart of the noise. And there I suddenly heard and even saw on paper the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, of our unduplicated national pep, of our metropolitan madness." And that's a great label for a lot of Gershwin's music. "By the time I reached Boston, I had a definite plot of the piece as distinguished from its actual substance." So he took a train journey. By the time he got off, Rhapsody in Blue was there in his head. Amazing. Now, in 1924, George and Ira Gershwin collaborated on a stage musical comedy called Lady Be Good, which included such future standards of the jazz repertoire as Fascinating Rhythm and Lady Be Good. They followed this up with shows such as OK in 1926, Funny Face in 1927, and Strike Up the Band in 1930. Gershwin's star was very much on the rise. But he wasn't content to just be a songwriter in New York. He was always striving to be more than the sum of his parts. He was always looking for a new ingredient for the melting pot. And he was fascinated by the music of Europe, in particular, the growing French style, the Impressionist style, which we mentioned in last week's deep dive in the context of Debussy. And so he travelled to Paris in the mid-1920s, eager to find someone who would teach him in this style. And he applied to study composition with this lady here. This is Nadia Boulanger, and she is one of the most important figures in classical and in music in general of the 20th century. And we are going to do a deep dive on her very, very soon. Now, she, as one of the most prominent teachers of the 20th century, would have been the perfect person to take Gershwin under her wing, but she turned him down. Not because he wasn't an amazing musician and a prodigious talent, because she was worried that rigorous classical study would ruin his distinctive voice, his jazz-influenced style. And it's a shame, because she went on to mentor such amazing musicians and soloists and arrangers as Daniel Barenboim, Lennox Berkeley, Aaron Copland, John Eliot Gardner, Philip Glass, Quincy Jones, and more. But she turned down poor old Gershwin, as indeed did his hero, Maurice Ravel. He was desperate to study with Ravel, but Ravel turned him down for the same reason. And in doing so, he provided Gershwin with one of the best and sweetest rejections in all of music, which some of you will already have heard. And I've quoted this to so many students over the years. He said to him, "Why become a second-rate Ravel when you're already a first-rate Gershwin?" I think that although Gershwin would have been understandably disappointed, I think that would have soothed that burn ever so slightly, wouldn't it? Now, Gershwin's friendship with Ravel sparked the creation of another of his best-loved and most classic pieces, of course, An American in Paris. Gershwin returned to the USA, but he was strongly encouraging Ravel to come with him to play his music around the nation. Now, Ravel was reticent to do so until Gershwin managed to find someone who would sponsor him to the tune of $10,000, which, unsurprisingly, enticed Ravel over for a tour in 1928. And when Ravel reached New York on this the particular tour, Gershwin was there to fondly greet him. And on Ravel's return to Paris, Gershwin found that Ravel's tour had reignited his fascination and his love of the European sound, and he wanted to return to Paris, which he did with his brother Ira. And while staying in France, Gershwin wrote An American in Paris, and this evokes the sights and energy of the French capital. Gershwin said, "My purpose here is to portray the impressions of an American visitor in Paris as he strolls about the city, listens to the various street noises, and absorbs the French atmosphere." Now, Gershwin wrote for a huge full symphony orchestra with the addition of a celesta, saxophones, and tuned taxi horns, which of course creates a distinctive and unique melting pot sound. The addition of saxophones in the classical orchestra was, again, very unusual. And the piece itself is structured into 5 sections, which culminate in a sort of a loose ABA format, with the opening and the ending being related and a little episode in the middle. And the A episodes either side are written in a distinctly French style, with the motifs writing very much after Debussy and Ravel, a very jaunty sort of walking style. But the middle section is what's known as the homesickness section, where he brings forth the American blues style and then weaves them together towards the end. It is an absolute masterpiece and would form the basis of much of his future work. Now, between 1929 and 1935, George and Ira Gershwin produced some of the most era-defining songs of their careers. These included, from the show Showgirl, 1929, which was a huge hit, it featured Duke Ellington conducting the orchestra and had a huge ballet section at the beginning of Act 2, set to An American in Paris. And the 1930 show Girl Crazy boasted such hits as I Got Rhythm and the wonderful Embraceable You, which was a huge hit sung by the great Ginger Rogers. Now, Gershwin's greatest work was yet to come. He spent the summer of 1934 on Folly Island in South Carolina after he was invited to visit by the author of the novel Porgy, called Dubose Howard. He was inspired to write the music to his opera Porgy and Bess whilst on this working vacation. Now, Porgy and Bess is Gershwin's opera, and it was first performed in Boston on the 30th of September 1935 before it moved to Broadway in New York City. It featured a cast of classically trained African-American singers, which was a highly daring artistic choice at that time. The libretto of Porgy and Bess tells the story of Porgy, a disabled street beggar who lives in the slums of Charleston. It deals with his attempts to rescue Bess, his beloved, from the clutches of Crown, her violent and possessive lover, and Sporting Life, her drug dealer. The opera plot generally follows the stage play, and Gershwin said Porgy and Bess is a folk tale. Its people would naturally sing folk music. When I first began work on the music, I decided against the use of original folk material because I wanted the music to be all of one piece. Therefore, I wrote my own spirituals and folk songs, but they're still folk music. And therefore, being an operatic form, Porgy and Bess becomes a folk opera. And the spirituals and folk songs he's referring to are pieces that are just so quintessentially famous now. Pieces like I Got Plenty of Nuttin', It Ain't Necessarily So, and of course, Summertime. Now, a fascinating aspect of Porgy and Bess is that it was originally simply called Porgy, as indeed was the novel. But this lady here changed all that. This, everyone, is Anne Brown, and she was a student at Juilliard, 20 years old. She was the first African-American vocalist ever to be admitted to Juilliard. And whilst there, she read that Gershwin was going to write a musical version of Porgy. And she wrote to him and asked to come and sing and help him with the score. And Gershwin's secretary invited her to come and meet George Gershwin. Gershwin was very impressed and began asking Brown to come and sing the songs as he composed them for Porgy. Interestingly, the character of Bess was originally a minor character. But as Gershwin became more and more impressed with Brown's singing, he expanded the part of Bess and cast Brown in the role. When they'd completed rehearsals and were ready to begin the previews of Porgy and Bess, Gershwin invited Brown to join him for lunch. At that meeting, he told her, I want you to know, Miss Brown, that henceforth and forever after, George Gershwin's opera will be known as Porgy and Bess. Isn't that fabulous? Now, although the first run of Porgy and Bess was not a commercial success, and it ran to 4 hours and 2 intervals, it has since been revived countless times and is considered Gershwin's masterpiece. It is one of the most important cultural works of the 20th century. And unfortunately, as Porgy and Bess was not a success, Gershwin left New York in search of pastures new, as he always did. And in 1936, he moved to Hollywood in hopes of becoming a film composer. In fact, scored a number of movies there in the burgeoning film area, and was given the job of scoring Shall We Dance for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. This, again, needed a new type of music, marrying jazz and ballet. Now, writing and orchestrating the score for this took months, and the actual final music lasts over an hour. So it is a colossal undertaking, and Gershwin was poised to become one of the preeminent composers of the golden age of film music. However, in 1937, Gershwin began complaining of blinding headaches and being able to smell burning rubber. His condition quickly deteriorated until he was diagnosed with a brain tumour. Despite urgent surgery, he died on July the 11th, 1937, aged only 38 years old. His friends and admirers were shocked and devastated. The great writer John O'Hara remarked, "George Gershwin died on July 11th, 1937, but I don't have to believe it if I don't want to." A memorial concert was held for Gershwin at the Hollywood Bowl on September the 8th, 1937, at which the great conductor Otto Klemperer conducted his own orchestration of the second of Gershwin's 3 preludes, that Blue Lullaby. It was the perfect send-off for George, one of the greatest composers to ever lift a pen in the world. And this piece, which began our lecture today and is going to close it, was the perfect encapsulation of Gershwin and his style. Achingly beautiful, with a yearning and soothing melody, could have been written by a French master except for its underlying jazz and ragtime influences. A piece that Gershwin brought into the world and said goodbye to him as he left behind this enormous body of work, which he himself called a Blue Lullaby. And here's Anna to play it for us one more time. I think what set Gershwin apart was his ability to manipulate these forms of music into his own unique voice. He took the jazz he discovered on Tin Pan Alley into the mainstream and spliced it with the popular songs of his era. He brought his expertise in the classical genre and married it to the new Impressionist and French styles to leave us with a body of work that is both breathtaking and delightful in its scope and impact. And although Gershwin would seldom make grand statements about his music, he believed that true music must reflect the thoughts and aspirations of the people and time. My people are Americans. My time is today. And in fact, his time is all time. His time is timeless. And I do hope you've enjoyed learning about this great musician, this great American, this great citizen of the world.